The meeting might have started. Just 1 second, I will check. Yes, we are now live. So we should start. Dear attendees and participants of our conversation, we are honored to be here this evening with our special guest. We are honored to be here this evening with our special guest. We are honored to be here this evening with our special guest. We are honored to be here this evening with our special guest. We are honored to be here. Do you hear the echo?
Yes, a little bit.
Me too. Do you hear the echo?
Yes, a little bit.
Me too. Do you hear the echo?
Yes. Okay, sorry for the technical trouble. Just in a minute.
Vika, do you have wait a minute, please, just a minute. Вика, у тебя есть включенный стрим сейчас или нет? Почему тогда звук включенный стрим сейчас или нет? Is that better?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Oh. No, it's not. Sorry, and
We can hear you just fine. There's no echo now.
Not just the records.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. You may start.
Maybe we should try to restart the meeting.
Do you mean in Zoom?
Yes, because
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Or
you can hear me, but do you hear the?
no, I don't hear the echo. No, everything is fine right now.
Just me, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So let's start again. We're sorry for technical problems. Dear attendees and participants of our conversation, we are honored to be here this evening with our special guest, the Counselor for Public Affairs at the US Embassy in Kyiv, Волтер Браунолер. As a diplomat, he previously served overseas as the Consul General in Prague of Poland, spokesperson at the US Embassy in Bangkok, Thailand, and spokesperson at the US Embassy in Khartoum, Sudan. He has also completed tours in Sydney, Baghdad, and Washington.
Mr. Bраунолер began his diplomatic career in 2002 as a vice consul at the US Embassy in Bangkok. Before joining the Foreign Service, Mr. Bраунолер worked for a technology startup in New York City and also as an analyst at the US Government Accountability Office. He speaks Thai, Polish, and Ukrainian. Please welcome Волтер Браунолер.
All right. Dobry wieczór. Мене звати Волтер Браунолер. Я дуже радий бути тут сьогодні. Я радником посла з питань преси, освіти та культури у американському посольстві у Києві. And thanks for having me tonight. Really appreciate it.
Me too. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yes, thank you very much. And now we should move to the questions that we have prepared for this event.
Go for it.
Even though it might sound like a basic question, in order to provide the students with a comprehensive understanding of your background, could you please tell us how you decided to become a diplomat in the first place? Who
Sure.
encouraged you to follow this kind of path?
I think I'd always been interested in international relations. So we had a Model United Nations club in high school that I was a part of, and I loved it. And then I continued that in college. I ran our little club in university, and I always had a great time with it. But I really didn't know much about being an American diplomat until we had a diplomat in residence. So an American diplomat who had had 20 or 30 years of experience, and he had an assignment at the university. And his whole job was to recruit for the Foreign Service, recruit for the diplomatic service of the United States. And so I talked to him, and it just sounded like he had this great life, you know? He got to live overseas in different countries, and he was paid to learn languages. And I think he had even found love along the way. You know, he had married someone on one of his assignments, and his kids had gone to these fabulous, schools everywhere around the world. And it really appealed to me, my interests, international relations and politics and economics, then, being combined with this lifestyle. And so I asked him, I was like, how do you get involved? And in the US, you take an exam, you take a civil service exam. And it's designed so that anyone who has, just a high school education and 21 years or older is eligible. Those are the only requirements. And if you pass, and you hit a certain score, they give you an interview. And if you pass the interview, you get a job. So I did that my last year of graduate school. And it worked out from there. I had a little bit of time, before I actually joined the Foreign Service. And that's when I worked for the US Government Accountability Office. But then pretty quickly, I transferred to the State Department, which is where a lot of our Foreign Service comes from, and I've been working in embassies and in Washington ever since.
Wow, that is really inspirational. Thank you. So let's talk about an inevitable part of every diplomat. These are languages. Mm-hmm. So you are fluent in Thai, Polish, and Ukrainian. And without exaggeration, I must admit, you speak Ukrainian very well. And could you share some tips concerning the language learning process, and how does the knowledge of Ukrainian help you in your diplomatic career?
Dapper. So like I was saying, it's really a pleasure to be able to learn languages as your job. So in the United States, at least, we spend usually 1 year learning languages. And so that's your full-time job, all day, every day. You go to class, and then you have homework, and you have assignments and projects, and they start you out easy, learning the alphabet or learning how to read or write. And very quickly you get into all the topic areas that you have to use. So it's, unfortunately, some of it's not super useful. Like, I wish they would teach us more about how to, negotiate at a market instead of how to negotiate a trade agreement, that sort of thing. But it's great instruction. It's always from native speakers. So all of my teachers were Ukrainians who have been moved to the United States. And they all have, their specialty is teaching languages. And so they have a degree in linguistics or whatever else. And so they're able to teach us very well. I think it's essential, for any country, you have to be able to communicate in the local language, not only, just to do the basics of, talking to people and getting around and everything else, but I think also as a matter of respect. You've put in the time to learn the language, and I think along with learning a language, you automatically learn some of the culture as well, and how people think and how people's history has evolved, and especially in a place like Ukraine, I think where language is such an important part of identity, it really makes a big difference. So yes, the one thing with languages, at least for me, it gets harder as I get older. So I find that I speak Thai pretty well still. I learned Thai in my 20s. I learned Polish in my 30s, and I learned Ukrainian in my 40s. So it gets harder and harder as I get older. But it's still, I mean, what a gift to be able to do this for my job. And it's also nice too, because it provides sort of a natural break between assignments sometimes. So I spent 2015 to 2018 in Poland, and then went back to the United States for a little while, and then came out to Ukraine in 2020. So, being able to spend some of that time back home, recharging, being closer to family, and then, learning language is great. In the US Foreign Service, we have a big school, a big university called the Foreign Service Institute. And they teach you a lot of things there, but I would say about 80% of the school is devoted towards learning languages. And so you walk down one hallway and you hear people speaking Arabic, and you walk down another hallway and people are speaking Spanish, Ukrainian, Chinese, it just goes on and on. And so it's almost like being in New York City or something, where you hear all of these, different cultures and languages bouncing off one another every single day. But no, it's great.
I believe so.
Yes, that's great. That's at this university, some people speak Ukrainian. That sounds cool. And moving to the next question. Before joining the Foreign Service, you worked for a technology startup in New York City. Is it true?
Yes. So between undergraduate and graduate school, I worked for a small internet firm in New York City called eTensity. They're a technology consulting firm, so they worked with a lot of big companies. I'm sure you've heard of IBM, AT&T, all this sort of stuff. And this was in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, and before, just as I think the internet was, becoming a real big thing. And so this was the first big push of, technology companies and everything else. And I left the company because I decided to go to graduate school. And it was interesting. And then about 6 months later is when we had this, in the United States, this bust of technology companies. In the early 2000s, a lot of them that had gotten really big all of a sudden went poof. And so it happened to be a good time to be in school and going back and trying something else. But what I took away from that is, it's fascinating, the power of business. Of course, my business now is diplomacy. And I'm a big believer that there's a lot of things you can hammer out in person, in public, and private. But there's also a lot of power that comes from entrepreneurship and business, and being able to increase investment in good ideas, and also, to be honest, to let bad ideas fail. And so that's a lesson that I've always taken with me from that time in the private sector. And then, of course, just the accelerating nature of technology and everything that we do. And I think you see it more and more, but I think things that used to be done only in person, they can be great, but then you put them online, and they can have sometimes such a bigger effect. I mean, look at this right now. Normally, I think if it weren't in COVID times or whatever else, and you guys were all meeting in person for a class, I'd be talking to the class, and that'd be great, and I would love that. But instead, maybe I can talk to more people this way. Maybe this is being recorded or streamed, and more people can see it. And this multiplier effect of technology. This is just one tiny example. And so I've tried to take some of those lessons and apply it to what we do in government work as well.
Also, thank you for the answer. As far as we are concentrated or we are focused on your career, let's talk about the time when you used to work as an analyst at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And taking this fact into consideration, could you explain why logic and strategic thinking are crucial for a diplomat?
Sure. It was funny, I actually took the job at the Government Accountability Office because I was waiting for my security clearance to join the Foreign Service. You have to wait for the FBI to say that you're not a criminal, and you're not a spy for another country or whatever else. And so I took a job with the U.S. Accountability Office, and I analyzed, government programs to make sure that they weren't corrupt or they didn't have waste, that sort of thing. And it was interesting. It taught me a lot about, how government works. And then as soon as 6 months later or so, I ended up joining the State Department. It was interesting. It was a good foray into government. I thought they were going to hire me for a job in Washington, D.C., and they ended up sending me down to Alabama, which in America's South. And I'm from Michigan. I'm from the north between Chicago and Detroit. And so for me, it was one of my first big cultural experiences, I guess. I think, I don't know what the equivalent would be, if you were from, Lviv and someone sent you to work in Donetsk or something for 6 months or something, you're like, oh, okay, well, this is a different kind of culture. Okay, neat. And so I always joke, it was my first foreign assignment was to go down to Alabama. But then, about 6 months later, I headed to DC and I got my first assignment, Thailand. So I learned Thai and then headed out from there.
Wow, that sounds cool.
Yes, and we also prepared the question about your past. We know that you have served as the US diplomats in Poland, Thailand, Sudan, Iraq, and now you are in Ukraine. And the question is, how does the place of diplomatic service affect you? And do you have any preferences as the place to do the service, or is it difficult to stay away from home for such long periods?
Yeah, it's definitely hard to be away from home. I think that's the hardest part, especially as I get older and my kids get older and my parents get older. It's tough. You watch people age from a distance, and it's easier these days. I think when I started, there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram, there was no TikTok or Twitter or anything. And so it's a little easier to stay in touch with people, see what they're doing. You can Skype home and, listen to people and talk to them. That was a little harder in the beginning, but it's still tough. So we try to get home once a year. We don't always make it, especially in an age of COVID, but we try to go home for at least a week or two, just to give our kids that time with their grandparents and everything else. I don't really have a preference on where I've worked. I don't like to work in the super easy places, but I don't like to work in the super hard places either. I like to go right in the middle, I think. I've done both. Earlier on in my career, I served in Iraq when it was still kind of a war zone, and that was very difficult. And I served in Australia when it was a very nice place to live, but the work was just kind of boring. There's not a whole lot of diplomacy going on between America and Australia. We tend to agree on a lot of things, and there's no language barrier or anything like that. And so after learning from those two extremes, I like places that are a little bit more in the middle, where there's a lot of interesting things going on. You can actually make progress in a relationship between our two countries. And then more recently, now that I have children, I like to be in places that, they're relatively safe. They have access to medical care if they get sick, that sort of thing. And so I think I'll go just about anywhere, but, I don't, at this certain point in my life, I don't want to go to a place where my kids can get, tropical diseases easily or that sort of thing. But everything else is on the table. I really enjoyed, being here and being in Poland. It's just been an incredible cultural experience. The culture here is so rich in Central and Eastern Europe. But I've also really enjoyed being in Thailand. I've served twice in Bangkok, and it's just what a totally different experience than being home in the United States or being in Europe. Just a completely different culture, and it's been one that was a total pleasure to immerse myself in. And it's going to hold a special place in my life because my daughters were born there, and we just have a lot of great memories from being there as well. So it just depends. But for me, it's that sweet spot. I don't think I would be happy living in London or Paris. It's just, there's not the kind of change that you see. Just being in Ukraine the past year and a half, I feel like I've seen major changes. And same thing, being in Poland for 3 years, you could see the country, grow and move. And in some countries, you don't have that kind of change.
Yeah, I do believe that safety is essential. So, and let's talk a little bit about your current position. And one of your responsibilities as the Counselor for Public Affairs is facilitating the process of student exchanges.
Yes.
And what difficulties do you face on the daily basis in this sphere? And how can we attract more Americans to come study in Ukraine?
So I'm a huge believer in exchanges. I think that, you have someone, from Ukraine who spends a year of high school or university in America, and it changes them. They become a lifelong ambassador for that relationship, between America and Ukraine, or whatever country that they're from in America. And so, and yes, it's a big commitment, and yes, it's a risk, and yes, you have to pick up your whole life and move there, but what a cool thing. And, we've been able to replicate that, hundreds of times. And I think these are the people who, are very well positioned to, bring the relationship even closer, or go off and do something really cool in their lives. So I've met so many alumni of our exchange programs who, because of their experience in the United States, or because of, their time in the US, they've improved their, something simple from like their English skills, or their connections that they've made, or this spirit of entrepreneurship, or whatever else. They've gone on to have these really cool careers, either in government or academia or business or whatever else. And it's just awesome to track people and see their progress as they go on in life. So I love going over to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Office of the Presidency, and talking to some people who, maybe when they were 16, they did an exchange program with Flex, or they did an undergraduate program with UGrad, or they did a Fulbright program as a graduate student or something, and talk to them about how it affected them and how it changed their life. We do have challenges, that's for sure. One of them is that we have far more applicants for these exchange programs than we have space for. So we're really lucky in Ukraine. We have hundreds and hundreds of spots, but we have thousands and thousands of applicants. And so it's tough choosing, who goes and who doesn't, because we know that, so many people, these people are qualified. And if they don't go to America, we're going to lose out. They're going to go to Germany, they're going to go to France, they're going to go to the UK, and that's tough, that's hard. And so I've been fighting for more and more resources from the US, because I say, look, this relationship is super important, and we need to have more people in it. I think there are some challenges. I think 99% of the people who go on these exchange programs have a great time, and they come back, and it's an amazing experience. But there are 1% of these people, they're going to have a bad experience. Something's going to happen, or the program doesn't live up to their expectations or whatever else. And so we spend, like anything in life, you spend 90% of your time on 10% of the problem or whatever else. And so we do that a little bit as well. But overall, I would say it's overwhelmingly positive for the people who do the exchange. And it's really positive, I think, in the long term as well. I can't tell you how many people I work with in Ukraine who work for an international organization, or work in the Ukrainian government, or work in Ukrainian business, who they're in that field because of the experience that they had on an exchange program.
Yeah,
and not necessarily just with us, but they've gone somewhere else, and they've gotten that perspective, not only of that other country, but that perspective that comes from looking at your own country when you're somewhere else. And I think that's very valuable.
I believe that, really.
Yes, so we are moving to the next question. We have talked about your current position, about your previous position as at the startup in New York. And is it for you better to work on public service or in private sector? Could you compare advantages and disadvantages of both?
Sure. Gosh. I mean, the one big thing is probably the money. So in the private sector, I think you can definitely make a lot more money. I have a lot of friends who work for, you know, Amazon or Google or Facebook or whatever else, and I'm sure they make a lot more money than I do. On the other hand, you know, they don't have the kind of experiences, right? Like they don't get to, you know, move to a different city every 2 or 3 years overseas and kind of have a different varied job like I do. You know, there's that sense of public service. You know, I feel like what I do makes a difference, not just for me and for my family, but also for, you know, all of my countrymen back home in the United States, and hopefully, you know, wherever I'm posted, wherever I'm serving. So hopefully, you know, making a big difference in the lives of Ukrainians or Poles or Thai people or whatever else. And I'd like to think maybe, you know, I have a better chance of doing that than some people who are working in the private sector, but you never know. I think, you know, going back to the language thing, I think it's a very rare thing to be able to spend, you know, a year at a time learning a language and have that be part of your job. You know, I don't think I know anyone in the private sector who kind of gets that. So that's a nice plus. And for me, it's more about the variety too. You know, in a weird way, I get sort of a new job every 2 or 3 years. And I think that's rare too, if you work in the private sector, especially if you stay with the same company for a long time. You don't get to switch it up as much. And so I get to have a career, but also the variety that comes with the career. So I don't know, it's, there's some pluses and minuses, I guess. But, you know, obviously I like it. You know, I've always said, you know, if I find something better to do, I'll do that. But for 20 years, I've really enjoyed doing this.
Oh, that sounds like advice. Also, another responsibility of yours, I mean, at your current position, is countering disinformation. And what challenges and pressing problems do you experience in the information field in the country, I mean, in a state of hybrid, including information war?
Yeah, so that's incredibly important. It's one of the biggest reasons that, you know, we do so much in Ukraine is to counter disinformation. And by the way, it's not just, you're not doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. You know, the United States recognized a long time ago that the kind of threat that Ukraine sees from disinformation, you know, it can affect not just Ukraine, but the rest of Europe, the United States. You know, we say, you know, what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. You know, so when Ukraine sees things like, you know, election interference or, you know, just fake news or whatever you want to call it, you know, these are the same phenomena that we see in the rest of Europe these days, or back in the United States these days. And so that we really consider Ukraine to be at the forefront of disinformation and countering that disinformation. There's a lot of very smart people here working to counter it. And so we work with them, both in the government. Now there are these 2 anti-disinformation centers, one with the Ministry of Culture and one with the National Security and Defense Council. So we work very closely with them. We work with a lot of NGOs, a lot of international organizations like Stop Fake or Detector Media to help, you know, sort out that disinformation and figure out the best ways to counter it. We also work with a lot of educational organizations to teach critical thinking in universities or in schools in Ukraine, and to really, you know, try to help inoculate sort of the next generation so that, you know, what works today as part of an effective disinformation campaign hopefully won't work tomorrow or, you know, in the next generation. And so people will be better off, not just in Ukraine, of course, but I think, you know, the whole region.
Mr. Bраунолер, just a quick question. Could you give any pieces of advice? How can you distinguish real information from the propaganda or disinformation? I
think the biggest thing is just to have the mindset that not everything you see is true, right? And it doesn't matter if you see it, you know, 5 or 10 different places. You have to really think critically about what you're receiving, what you're reading, what you're seeing, and you always have to think, you know, who benefits from this? You know, who benefits if I get angry about this little piece of information? Who benefits if I share this piece of information? Also, you know, does this make sense? You know, is this something, before I send it on to a friend or forward it or whatever else, should I do a search on this? Because so many times, and I fall into the same trap, like I'll see something and I'll say, that sounds like a crazy bit of news. Like I want to send this along to my friends. And then I catch myself. I'm like, well, wait, let's look this up real quick. And a lot of times if organizations are doing their jobs, if, you'll find something debunking or, explaining, why this particular little fact isn't true or whatever else. But it's hard to do. I mean, I have to stop myself a lot of times, and this is the field I work in, I feel like, right? And so, and of course, I'm sure we've all seen it 10 times worse, from our parents or our grandparents or our aunts or our uncles who, they'll send us something on WhatsApp or whatever else. Have you seen this? And like, no, uncle, this is not true, And it's a problem. I think, it's not unique to Ukraine by any means. But it's one that is definitely very pervasive here.
Yeah, it happens like in my family every single evening, I guess, in our family chat.
Yep.
Yes, that was an interesting fact you have told, and also considering public diplomacy, which is closely linked with your position. Do modern social networks such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter play a big role in the spread of and popularization of national culture? Do you believe that the government should use these channels of communication to popularize the country across the world?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like particular
so we use
country.
social media a great deal. Here in Ukraine, but almost every country now, we go where the eyeballs are. We go where people are listening, and we find in Ukraine, for instance, that people really pay attention to what's on Telegram, what's on Facebook, what's on Instagram, and so that's where we try to be too. Talking again about countering disinformation, one of the key ways to counter disinformation is to put out correct information. And so if we see a wave of bad information out there, for instance, just this past weekend, we were seeing a lot of disinformation or misinformation from Russia about US ships in the Black Sea, militarizing the Black Sea and, warmongering or whatever else. And so we put something out on Saturday night on Facebook talking about what we were really doing, which is a regular exercise with 2 American ships, 2 Ukrainian Navy ships, Turkish ships, Romanian ships, a big international exercise in the Black Sea, promoting the freedom of navigation. This idea that no one country should control international waters, and we put out images and exactly what we were doing, the truth. And we find that a lot of times that's a very good way to neutralize misinformation or disinformation that's out there. So we use every platform that's popular. It depends, I think, country to country. Some places, where the government has very tightly controlled access to the internet or social media, we might use more traditional ways of interacting with mass media, more radio or television. And we do that here as well. National radio is still huge in Ukraine. A lot of people still watch television, and especially an older generation, that's their primary source of getting news. So yes, we engage across all media, but I would say the huge growth in the past 10 years or so, of course, has been social media. That's only accelerated during COVID. I think, if you're like me, at least, the last 2 years, people have spent a lot more time looking at their phone, looking, at their laptop screen, whatever else. And it's no different for us. So we've seen a huge growth in the number of people looking at our stuff on social media.
Yeah, so social media is very important factor in the diplomacy in the digital age.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so and let's talk a little bit about cultural diversity. Also, as we all know, the political situation in Ukraine is quite difficult, and especially it affects people's idea of common culture from west to east. And therefore, do you think promoting cultural knowledge among Ukrainians is beneficial for our country? I mean, is cultural diversity and inclusion policy necessary in the Ukrainian context, or it might be dangerous for our national security?
Cultural inclusion in the Ukrainian context, like different cultures within Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean that.
Okay. Yeah, I absolutely. I think it's a good value for any country. To be honest, it's not a huge focus of ours. I think primarily our job is to translate, American policy and American values to Ukraine. And so to the extent that we do that in every region of Ukraine, toward every people in Ukraine, yes, we try to be as inclusive as we can. But it's not, I don't believe it's our role to tell Ukraine, you need to be inclusive, or you need to do this in this way, or this culture, or whatever else. Not so much. That said, because it's a value of ours, we believe that, diversity makes you stronger, and that when you have a wide array of diverse opinions, you can do more and you can make better choices, etc. I think that's reflected in some of the programs that we run in Ukraine. So for instance, when we recruit for exchange program participants, we don't just get people from Kyiv, or we don't just recruit from Lviv, or we don't just recruit from Kharkiv. We try to get diversity of backgrounds, geographics, education levels, interests, that sort of thing, so that the Ukrainians that go to the United States for a program represent all of Ukraine. And when they come back, they still represent all of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Yes, that's quite significant salt among the Ukrainian borders. And moving to the next question, as you have been working in the diplomatic field since 2002, that is a really long career path. And of course, there should be ups and downs. That's why the next question is, what is your greatest professional achievement that you think is one of the most significant?
Yeah, that's a good question. On a personal level, I think there was one time in Iraq where we got some information that there was going to be a terrorist bombing that was going to go off, and so my office moved very quickly, and we warned another embassy that this bombing was imminent, and we let them know, and we prevented it from happening. And so we prevented this explosion going off, possibly preventing lives from being lost, right? And so on a very personal level, I'm very proud of that. Like we put all the information together, we communicated to the right people, and we prevented something bad from happening. And so that's something that I'm very personally proud of. Professionally, when I was in Poland, we worked very hard to remove the requirement for Poles to have visas to go to the United States. So because of the work that we did between 2015 and 2018, now your average everyday Pole doesn't have to get a visa anymore to go to the United States, which was great. Poland was the only country, I think one of the only countries left in the EU that still had to get visas to go to the United States, and now they don't. And so that's been great for Poland. It's been great for America. We've really increased the number of people that go back and forth between the two countries, and it's been great. And so I think, and it was a great example to show, what a win-win situation can look like. And it's something that I would love to see in other places around the world.
Well, thank you. I would like to talk a little bit about the situation which is currently in Ukraine, and particularly so my question is, how do you assess the effectiveness of the international consultation and coordination format, for example, the Crimea platform, as a response to the ongoing occupation of Crimea? Are these measures enough, or should more actions be taken?
Oh, that's tough. I'm a huge fan of the Crimean platform. I think it's essential right now, especially now that 7 or 8 years have passed since Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea. The attention has to continually be brought to this issue. The world has to recognize that this is not over. This is still an ongoing occupation. The international community can never accept it. The United States has stated we will never accept it. But we have to continually remind the rest of the world that this is a huge issue. This is Europe in the 21st century, and one country has just stolen part of another country, or tried to steal a part of another country, and that shouldn't be acceptable. So I'm a big fan of the Crimean platform, especially with the attention that it raises, and again, the platform that it creates to address this issue and keep it in the forefront for other countries. And that's difficult. That's a difficult thing, to keep attention when there are so many other issues going on at all times. But it's one that the United States is definitely committed to. Last week, of course, we had Foreign Minister Kuleba in Washington again for our Strategic Partnership Commission, and this is a huge part of it. Not only Crimea, but also the situation in eastern Ukraine and Donbass, and more these days, the troop buildup of Russian troops that you've probably seen in the media. Not too far across Ukraine's borders. So these are things that we're going to continue to work with Ukraine, to talk to the rest of the world about, and just try to find solutions to.
Yeah, I believe so. Thank you.
Yes, and moving to the next question, we are turning back again to the culture and public diplomacy like that. And do you think that cultural diplomacy is an important factor in building bridges between societies and enhancing mutually beneficial cooperation?
Yes, absolutely. I think without cultural diplomacy, you just have what we call quid pro quo, right? Just a very transactional diplomacy. If you do this, then we will do that. And to me, that's diplomacy without heart. It's diplomacy without a real relationship, and it's more of just a business transaction. And it's something that can be, unfortunately, undone as soon as you get a better deal. As soon as something better comes along, and that's not what we want our diplomacy to be about. That doesn't reflect, I think, Ukrainian values, doesn't reflect American values, and that's something that's repeated over and over again in the world. What we want is an enduring partnership. What we want is a relationship, not just over the course of a day or a week, but one that spans into years or generations. And in order to have that, I think you have to have a cultural component. And for us, that takes many forms. I think, again, exchanges is where I would love to put almost all of our resources into. I think it's a great place to build those relationships long term. But the other avenues, we bring jazz performances to Ukraine, and we bring American films to Ukraine, and we have festivals of American culture in Ukraine, this sort of thing. And these are ways that we can bring our two peoples together. And at the core, that's what diplomacy is about. Physically and mentally or ideologically, bringing people together to, even if you disagree, you're talking about the same issues. You're talking on the same stage, and you're working through things, as opposed to just relating to someone else, in a history book, or what you read online or whatever else. And so I think it's really important to have that element of cultural diplomacy, so that you can bring a relation to the next step.
Thank you, Mr. Bраунолер. A lot of students were actually interested in your lifestyle, beside the work time. And we got this question, what does your usual schedule look like? And do you set kind of goals for yourself? Perhaps New Year resolutions? And when do you get up? Could you please tell us about your habits and so on?
So I have 4 kids, and so I think almost all of my life outside of work these days revolves around them. My 4 children and my wife. you know, we're just in that stage of life where they're very young and they require a lot of attention. But you know, I love going to the movies. I'm a big film buff. You know, I love you know, getting out and getting on a bike ride whenever I can when the weather is good. Gosh, you know, I love to, you know, go camping, you know, making fires and, you know, just kind of relaxing, turning off the cell phone and, you know, sitting around a fire, having a good drink, you know, maybe, you know, barbecuing some meat, you know, have a little shashlik, that sort of thing. I think, you know, to me, like just, you know, not necessarily connecting with nature or anything else, but just disconnecting from work, disconnecting from, you know, life in a city or whatever else, and just enjoying the company of people around me, whether that's my family or friends or whatever else. I think it's just so important. And, you know, I try to take that little lesson from work that, you know, it's all about the people to people connection and try to apply it to my personal life as well. I really enjoy, you know, getting to know, you know, Ukrainian holidays or the holidays of wherever I am in a different country, because, you know, some of them are very similar, you know, like Christmas, you know, and then some of them are just very different. You know, so I love introducing Ukrainians to the whole idea of Thanksgiving or Halloween, you know, as we celebrate it. And then also, you know, we're just continually torturing our neighbors, you know, our Ukrainian neighbors with these, you know, American cultural traditions. You know, so my kids will have a lemonade stand, and so we'll try to sell lemonade, you know, right outside of our house, and, you know, and it's great. You know, some people say like, oh, I've seen this in a movie, you know, where, you know, American kids, they sell lemonade on the side of the street for, you know, a few cents or whatever else. And then some people are very distrustful, like, why are your young children selling us lemonade, this sort of thing. So I like exploring those, you know, differences in culture that can be, you know, very interesting, sometimes really funny, and sometimes just strange. And then, of course, I'm just a huge foodie, so I love exploring, you know, Ukrainian cuisine. I think it's amazing. You know, everything from vareniki to borscht. I mean, A, it tastes amazing, but B, it can just be had in so many varieties in so many different ways. You know, you of course can get Ukrainian food in the United States, but I feel like there's not a huge variety. Whereas here in Ukraine, I mean, it just, you know, it ranges the gamut, right? You can go, you know, any which way with it, which is cool. Yeah, so, whew, you know, I spent a good chunk of my time exploring Kyiv, exploring Ukraine. You know, we try to travel, you know, a little bit for work and a little bit for fun, you know, on the weekends. You know, it's a pretty accessible country. You know, you can jump in a car and, you know, in 5 or 6 hours, you can be down to Odessa, you know, or you can jump on a train and you can be, you know, out east or out west. And so I really enjoyed that as well.
Just a quick question. What is your favorite Ukrainian tradition?
Oh, gosh. That is a good question. I love just because it's so different from America. You know, when people wear the Vyshyvanka, you know, either for, you know, Vyshyvanka Day or any kind of big cultural celebration, I think it's so cool that, you know, there's this national dress, you know, so to speak, that people have, and some people get really into it, and it's from their hometown or their region or their village or whatever else, and so, you know, you can kind of like, oh, like, where's this one from? Oh, that's cool. Whereas there's no cultural equivalent in America, right? I can't think of a, you know, the same sort of thing. We don't have that. Yeah, like everyone just wears a T-shirt, or they wear a, you know, a baseball cap, you know, or their favorite sports team or whatever else. It's just not, it's not as nice. It's not as cool.
Yeah, so Ukraine is pretty unique in this perspective.
Yeah.
Yes, you have mentioned that topic of traveling around Ukraine. And I wanted to ask you, connected with this question, what sightseeing has impressed you the most, like when you visited it among the whole territory of Ukraine?
That's a good question. Phew. I mean,
I'm sorry, I would be accurate. And would you recommend your friends or from the America to come to the Ukraine to see these maybe sighting or
oh yeah, we've had a lot of visitors.
Nature wonder. Yeah,
they love it here. Again, for all the reasons I mentioned, but most of all, I think the people of Ukraine are so welcoming, especially to foreigners, I think, which is really great to see. I mean, they're proud of their country. They want to show it off, which they should. For me, I think my favorite city outside of, I mean, Kyiv is our home, right? It's our home away from home. So I think it is by default probably my favorite city. But we really enjoyed Lviv. I've been there, gosh, 4 or 5 times, and every time I go, I stumble down like a different street or a different alley, and I find something that's just magical. If it's a cafe or whatever else. It's a gorgeous city. I love how much history is crammed into Lviv. I've also really enjoyed Odessa. It seems, I haven't been everywhere in Ukraine, but it seems totally different than almost any other city in Ukraine. Different architecture, different history, a different look. So that's another one that I've really enjoyed visiting, either for work or for fun. And then I would have to say, just the natural beauty that exists almost everywhere. So, I did a little road trip last year out to the Carpathians, and just seeing the mountains and the streams, and I mean, it was the rolling hills. It was great. And I'm sure that this exists, this natural beauty, everywhere. But it just really struck me out west in the Carpathians how gorgeous this country is. So yeah, I think that's what I've enjoyed more than anything. I will say it would be great if it was easier to get around. Sometimes the roads, especially to the middle of nowhere, it takes a long time, or the trains take a long time. And so I think Ukraine will continue to attract more and more tourists as the infrastructure grows. And that's one thing I've seen, a big improvement even in the past 2 years here. I think the roads are constantly getting better, and I think as Ukraine attracts more investment, so will the airline connections and the trains and everything else, and that's just a natural part of growth.
Thank you for the answer. And on top of that, as we previously mentioned, you have a huge family, like 4 children and a golden retriever. And tell me, please, how do you maintain a work-life balance?
I mean, you have to. For me, I have to put the phone down at a certain point, and you have to be very clear. If something is an emergency, someone can call. But otherwise, I'm not gonna work past 7 o'clock at night, and you're not gonna get a hold of me until 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock the next morning. That sort of thing. You have to put boundaries on your life, and if something is an emergency, it's an emergency, and we'll deal with it. But otherwise, the rest of that time is for me and it's for my family. And there are some critical job functions in the embassy where someone has to be on call or someone has to be on duty, maybe through the night and that sort of thing. And so what we do is we split those up. And so, maybe every, one night of every week, you're on call if there's an emergency, if you have to go into the embassy or whatever else. But we try to split that up so that it's not the same person all the time, or that you don't lose all of your Friday nights, or you don't lose all of your Tuesdays or whatever else. And that's very important to me, because otherwise, people get burned out. And I think we've seen that during COVID more than anything, as the line between, your personal life and your work life, or your personal life and your school life, or whatever else, if you're home all the time, what's the difference if you're, in class, or if you're working, or if you're, you're on your me time. And especially in the beginning, I think there was a lot of that. And so we've had to redefine, all right, even if you're at home, you're at work, between 9 and 5 or whatever. And the rest of the time, that's your time still. And so I try to do that with the people that work for me and the people that I work for.
Yes, so setting your boundaries is a key here.
Yes.
So thank you for your answer. And the next question will be from the student who is, I suppose, interested in books. And the question is, what book do you recommend to students who study at International Relations Institute?
So Henry Kissinger has a book called Diplomacy, very famous. I would recommend that first and foremost. I think it covers everything you need to know as far as the basics, especially if you're talking, the school of realism, in international relations. I think it's a good one. If you want to get real kind of old school, I'm a big believer in Thucydides. Going back to the Greeks, I think it's a great lesson in not just diplomacy, but also war. And it's from, 5,000 years ago, but it's still relevant, I think, in the way that our world operates. What else? I think, it sounds almost cliche, but I'm a big fan of Thomas Friedman's books. Like the Lexus and the Olive Tree, The World is Flat. I think he does a very good job of breaking down how the modern world works and simplifying it. And there's a lot of lessons that can be extracted on how diplomacy and how international relations have shifted, especially in the last generation, the last 20 or 30 years or so.
Oh, thank you. So we made a note of that, and we are almost and we have almost run out of time, and we have the last question. So what advice could you give to students who want to become diplomats in the future?
I would advise, do something that you love, right? Like if you don't love it, you're going to be terrible at it. Or even if you're good at it, you'll be miserable in a matter of months or years or whatever else. So make sure that whatever you do, if you want to become a diplomat, if you want to go into education, if you want to be an academic, if you want to be in business, or make sure it's something that you love, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up for failure. I think broaden your definition of what diplomacy means too. So if you have your heart set on working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and only that will do, and you aren't able to get that job for whatever reason, they're not hiring, or there are no spaces available, or whatever, find different ways to reach your goal. Maybe there's something else you can do in diplomacy, but with a private company. They also have negotiations. They also work with governments. They also, can afford some of that lifestyle of living overseas, or doing something with foreign languages or whatever else. And so I think there are different ways to accomplish what you want in life. And so always, try to keep that in mind too. Talk to people who have done the job, so seek out, either a mentor or at least someone who, has maybe been doing something in that field for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or whatever else. And, just get coffee with them, see, if they have any advice for, how they got started in diplomacy. I can tell you about being an American diplomat, but I can't tell you a whole lot about the process of becoming a Ukrainian diplomat, because I've never been one. I talk to a lot of Ukrainian diplomats, but, I think their experiences are going to be different than mine. And so as much as you can, and I would take advantage of this time now when you're in university, to explore, as many different career paths as you possibly can. So when I started out in university, I I had this experience with a technology company, and so I started with, IT and, computer science, and I've always loved technology, but I hated programming, and I figured that out very quickly. And so I had this switch, to politics and to economics and all this other stuff. And thank goodness I did, because I think I would have been miserable. And so, but you have to use that time to experiment a little bit. And I love this. I don't know how you put it, but I feel like in America, maybe more than most places, we're encouraged to fail a little bit, to make, kind of a wrong choice or bad decision, you choose a wrong concentration, and you say, this is not for me, and then you have a little bit of that wasted time, but you don't have a wasted career, a wasted life, or whatever else. You try something else. And so I'm very, very appreciative of the fact that I got to start over again, and and all of my math and computer science classes became my electives, and I went down this road of being involved in international relations and politics instead. So I don't know, try it out, find people who have done it, seek them out, get their advice. Don't necessarily follow their advice, but listen to them, and see if it's something that you want to do. And then, do everything you can to get to where you want to be. And you'll find your way along the way.
Thank you so much.
So thank you. We would like to, again, thank you for being today with us. It was a great pleasure having this conversation with you. I'm sure our meeting was of great importance for students as well.
Well, great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate your time. And if you guys have any follow-up questions, Mark knows how to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to answer them. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, but